Okay, so let's continue with this second part of legal terminology in Spanish with respect to family law. So in this part, we will see or translate the legal consequences of marriage annulment. In Spanish, consecuencias legales de la anulación del matrimonio. Okay? So, unlike bigamous or incestuous marriage, which is void ab initio, annulled marriages are void from the time their nullity is declared by a court of competent jurisdiction. Okay, so in Spanish, a diferencia de un matrimonio en incesto o bigamia, que es nulo ab initio. That's the Latin, so we can include it as well as a Latin words, or in Spanish, desde el inicio, los matrimonios que se anulan son nulos desde el momento en que su nulidad es declarada por un tribunal de jurisdicción competente. Okay? So what happens with children? And this depends on the state or the applicable jurisdiction, but generally speaking, children born of parents who enter into the marriage are legitimate as to both parents, even if the marriage is later annulled or declared void. Okay. Los hijos nacidos de padres que celebraron un matrimonio son legítimos en relación con ambos padres, aun cuando el matrimonio haya sido anulado o declarado nulo con posterioridad. Okay. Now, what happens to property? Property is a very difficult area of the law to translate to Spanish because in common law jurisdictions, such as in the United States, property law has evolved or comes from the English property law. And property law in Spanish-speaking jurisdictions, such as Latin America or some jurisdictions in continental Europe, property law evolves from Roman law. So there are a lot of institutions in property law that do not have the same literal translation and do not exist in either of these different jurisdictions. However, we will try to accurately translate what happens to property. That would be with respect to propiedad. Tenancies by the entirety are converted to tenancy in common. So, for example, a tenancy by the entirety does not exist as such in Spanish-speaking jurisdictions, and the tenancy in common does not exist as such in Spanish-speaking jurisdictions. However, we can use some sort of equivalent institutions to try to explain ourselves in Spanish. as follows. La propiedad común o mancomunada se convierte en propiedad individual. That would be a fair translation. Okay? Now, with respect to wills, wills in Spanish is testamento. And remember, this is not a legal, we're not trying to explain family law or wills and estates law. I'm just trying to share how I would translate to Spanish certain concepts. So this, I took it from New York law. However, this may change from state to state. Okay, but for purposes of translation, what happens to wills when a marriage is annulled? Any disposition made to a former spouse is revoked. Cualquier disposición hecha a un ex cónyuge would be former spouse, se revoca y pasa como si el ex cónyuge hubiera fallecido antes del testador. Disqualifies a spouse to take elective share or participate in intestacy distributions. I would translate this as descalifica al cónyuge a participar en distribuciones por la vía intestamentaria. That would be intestacy. Intestamentaria. Okay. Now, statute of limitations for annulment may apply. Statute of limitations does not exist as such in Spanish. We cannot make a literal translation. Estatuto de limitaciones is not something that exists. However, we can use the similar concept or institution, which would be prescripción. La prescripción de la nulidad puede aplicar. Okay, prescripción means the time lapse you have to file certain action or request certain right. That would be the statute of limitations. Okay,